modern religious sanctuary. You are holding a printed bulletin, you find your padded seat, you're just, listening to the gentle acoustic music playing over the speakers.
Right, setting a very peaceful scene.
Exactly. And then suddenly, a blood-soaked, spear-wielding ancient warrior just kicks the doors open.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he's covered in the mud of a flooded river, he smells like copper and sweat, and he demands that you join him on the battlefield.
That is quite the visual.
It really is.
Yeah.
And that jarring, violent collision of worlds is exactly what we are unpacking today. Welcome to our deep dive.
Thanks. I mean, it completely shatters the illusion that sacred spaces are just meant to be, like, comforting refuges.
Right.
We really like our modern institutions to feel safe and predictable, completely insulated from the chaos of the outside world. But the historical texts paint a wildly different picture.
Which is the exact shattering that Joseph Bae is aiming for in a highly provocative meditation titled Mighty Men.
Yeah, he really doesn't hold back.
It's not at all. Bae takes the ancient, visceral accounts of King David's biblical warriors and basically wields them like a blunt instrument against modern church culture.
He really does.
He's looking at contemporary attitudes toward masculinity, religion, and institutional niceness, I guess you could say. And he is declaring an absolute war on all of it.
Bae is essentially holding up a hammered bronze shield from the ancient world, and he's forcing the modern religious adherent to look at the reflection in it.
Like a really harsh mirror.
Exactly. He wants to expose the massive, undeniable gap between the gritty reality of ancient biblical faith and what he views as the overly domesticated religion of today. And, that paradigm doesn't start in a climate-controlled building.
Where does it start?
It starts in the wild, unforgiving hills of Ziklag. He anchors his entire argument in the Old Testament, specifically 1 Chronicles 12.
Contextually, this is during a time when David is not yet king, right?
Yeah, correct. He is essentially a hunted outlaw. He's dodging the spears of a paranoid King Saul and just living in exile in the wilderness.
And according to the text, this is the exact moment when these warriors start flocking to him in the desert. Bae paints this incredibly vivid picture to establish a baseline of what he considers like true masculine glory.
Yeah, he talks about men with hearts burning like forge fires.
Right, you have the men of Issachar, who the text says understood the times and knew what Israel ought to do.
That specific phrasing is really interesting because it implies a high level of strategic brilliance.
Like they were the tacticians.
Exactly. They possessed a tactical awareness of the geopolitical landscape. They weren't just muscle, they were the intelligence wing.
But what is fascinating is how quickly Bae pivots from their strategic minds to just brutally physical, lethal capability.
Oh, absolutely.
He brings up the Benjamite archers who, according to the historical lore, could sling a stone at a single hair and not miss.
Right. And if you know anything about ancient warfare, a sling wasn't a child's toy.
Not even close.
These guys were firing lead or stun projectiles at speeds that could literally shatter a skull. They were the ancient equivalent of elite snipers.
The physics of that weapon required immense training and precision. And then he introduces the sons of Gad.
Yeah, Bae emphasizes that they had faces like lions.
Which is such an intense description.
It is. He says they were swift as gazelles on the mountains and that they crossed the Jordan River during its flood stage.
Which is an insane detail to include.
It really is when you unpack the mechanics of it. Crossing a swollen river in the springtime means the water is churning with snowmelt.
And sweeping heavy debris away.
Right. Exactly. And these men are crossing it in full ancient armor with spear and shield in hand just to reach David.
That's incredible.
It is a grueling life or death physical exertion that requires immense stamina and an almost fanatical devotion.
And he saves the most intense imagery for David's elite guard, a group known simply as the 30.
Yeah, Bae describes them in terms that sound like they belong in a fantasy novel.
Seriously. Terrible and glorious, with names that ring like hammered bronze. He highlights a warrior named Joseph, who allegedly lifted his spear against 300 men and felled them in a single encounter.
When you try to visualize the physical reality of a man engaging 300 combatants with a spear, the sheer endurance, the chaos, the blood, the spatial awareness required to survive a mass engagement like that,
It's mind-blowing.
it sets an impossibly high standard of martial prowess.
He also points to Abishai, who stood over David in a barley field and struck down giants just so the king could get a drink of water from the well of Bethlehem.
Right.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if you translate all of this into modern terms, Bae isn't describing a group of polite religious scholars.
No, not at all.
He's talking about unconventional shock troops. It sounds like Bae is describing an ancient special forces unit, right? Not diplomats, but shock troops.
That's a perfect analogy.
But how does he justify bringing this literal, physical battlefield energy into a modern spiritual setting? Especially considering he explicitly points out that these men were not nice, they were not polite, and they literally smelled of blood and sweat.
Well, Bae justifies it by fundamentally redefining righteousness. He moves the definition away from passive piety and toward active, dangerous loyalty.
Okay, so it's about loyalty.
Yes.
Yeah.
In his framework, these traits, the grit, the sweat, the lethal capacity for violence in service of a king, were not just unfortunate necessities of a barbaric Bronze Age.
What are they then?
He views these men as heroics incarnate. He believes this exact flavor of masculine glory, forged specifically in the fear of God, is the essential missing ingredient in the modern church.
Wait, so within his paradigm, being dangerous isn't a character flaw to be managed, it's an actual spiritual virtue.
Only if that danger is completely submitted to God. He argues that true covenant loyalty requires a spine of steel. You cannot defend the king or the faith if you are afraid of mud and the blood.
Wow.
Bae highlights the lion-faced men of Dad and the legendary 30 to prove that the biblical archetype of a godly man is not a harmless man.
Right.
It is a highly capable, highly dangerous man whose capacity for destruction is harnessed for a divine purpose.
So if Bae establishes this bloody, hyper-competent warrior as the ultimate spiritual baseline,
Sure.
how exactly does he view the modern guy sitting quietly in the pew? Because the contrast must be jarring.
It's beyond jarring. I mean, it's an indictment.
What does he say?
Bae argues that the modern church has been completely hollowed out by what he calls a castrated, risk-averse, feelings-first spirit.
Oh, wow. He uses very deliberate confrontational language there.
Very deliberate.
He's essentially saying the institution has traded courage for a suffocating kind of niceness.
And to back up that diagnosis, he doesn't just stay in the Old Testament. He moves into the New Testament to show that this warrior ethos wasn't just an ancient relic.
Right. He goes to the Apostle Paul.
Yes, he quotes Paul in 1 Corinthians 16:13, "Be on the alert, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong."
Here's where it gets really interesting, because Bae zeroes in on the original Greek word used in that verse, enarses. He translates it literally as be men or quit ye like men.
The etymology there is crucial to Bae's point. Enrises is derived from a lager, the Greek word specifically for a male.
Okay.
This is distinct from anthropos, which just means a human being in a general sense. Bae leans heavily on this etymological root to draw a hard, uncompromising line between biological reality and spiritual duty.
Hold on. Act like men is an incredibly loaded translation today. Bae translates and deigns literally to equate spiritual firmness specifically with biological masculinity. Is he saying that traditional Christian virtues like meekness have been completely misinterpreted by modern congregations?
Yes, absolutely.
Or is he outright replacing them with this ancient warrior ethos?
He absolutely views it as a biological imperative, not just a metaphor. By demanding that men stop apologizing for testosterone, Bae is asserting that male biology, the innate drive, the aggression, the protective instinct, is a divine design intended specifically for spiritual conflict.
That is a massive shift in perspective.
It is. He argues that the modern church's definition of meekness is actually just cowardice masquerading as virtue.
So when the modern church accommodates contemporary sensitivities, or softens its rhetoric to avoid offending people, or issues endless apologies for historical stances, Bae just sees a surrender.
He sees an existential threat. In his view, a feelings-first spirit is a direct betrayal of biblical commands. He explicitly calls out what he terms snowflakes, who melt at a hard word. He cites the book of Titus, chapter 1, verse 13, which instructs leaders to rebuke them sharply.
Rebuke them sharply, that's intense.
Bae argues that instead of the elder groveling to appease the hurt feelings of the congregation needs the bracing impact of the elder's rod.
Wow.
He isn't replacing Christian virtue. He is arguing that true Christian virtue cannot survive in a hostile world without this unapologetic masculine fortitude.
But if you diagnose the institution as being completely crippled by defensiveness and a willingness to grovel, you can't just prescribe a slight attitude adjustment.
No, you can't.
If the church is too defensive and soft, the only logical next step in Bae's framework is to mount a hyper-aggressive, risky offensive.
That is his exact prescription. He demands the church take the fight to the strong man's house, pulling from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 3, verse 27.
Right.
This isn't about retreating into a safe, holy huddle and complaining about the culture. It is a call for an outright invasion.
And he names literal physical targets on the map. He calls them no-go zones, specifically pointing to Glastonbury St. Michael's Tower and Pakistani gang enclaves.
Yes, very specific locations.
These aren't just random locations, they represent very different types of modern battlefields. Let's spend a minute unpacking why he chose these specific targets. What does Glastonbury represent in this context?
Well, Glastonbury St. Michael's Tower in the UK isn't just a historic building. It sits on what many believe to be ancient ley lines.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it is widely known as a major international hub for pagan, Wiccan, and New Age spirituality. It's a place steeped in King Arthur myths and mystic traditions.
Got it.
By targeting it, Bae is pointing his followers toward what he sees as the absolute center of opposing spiritual gravity. It's a call for visible supernatural confrontation with a completely different religious worldview.
And then you have the Pakistani gang enclaves, which introduce a completely different layer of complex, highly charged cultural and physical danger.
Very much so.
He's telling his readers to walk straight into the teeth of environments where preaching could genuinely get them physically hurt or spark severe socioeconomic tension.
Exactly.
And what does this offensive look like in these zones? He says you march in, you preach Christ crucified, with signs following, you cast out demons in a name that makes hell tremble, and you make sure that miracles are louder than the mockery.
Yeah, notice the emphasis on the visible and the miraculous there. This leans heavily into charismatic theology.
Right.
It's not about initiating a polite interfaith dialogue or hosting a community bake sale. He wants undeniable, supernatural displays of power that shatter the opposition's framework right in front of their eyes.
So what does this all mean? He's basically advocating for spiritual extreme sports.
That's a great way to describe it.
It's not about sitting in comfortable pews. It's actively seeking out the darkest, most challenging environments and demanding visible, miraculous results.
Yeah.
But from a practical standpoint, how does a leader actually sustain that level of adrenaline and risk in a congregation week after week? You can't just keep storming castles forever without people burning out.
That is the psychological crux of the movement Bae is trying to build. You are right that constant high-stakes conflict is exhausting.
Yeah, it has to be.
But Bae understands that going into hostile territory isn't just about the act of preaching. It is about the profound psychological rewiring that occurs within the participants.
It completely changes their identity.
The risk is the catalyst. It transforms them from being passive consumers of a weekend religious service into active combatants in a cosmic struggle.
Always.
When a person steps into a hostile enclave, faces down mockery, or believes they're casting out a demon, they aren't just reading about the lion-faced men of Gad anymore.
In their minds, they become one.
Exactly. They share in that ancient archetype. But to answer your question about sustainability, you cannot just fight. To prevent burnout, you have to institutionalize the memory of the battle.
You have to build the mythology.
You have to build the lore. This is Bae's brilliant strategy for long-term survival. He gives explicit directives to the church.
Like what?
Tell the stories. Name the names. Put the videos of these street confrontations up on the screens during the Sunday service. He wants them to build metaphorical monuments to the brothers who stormed the darkness and came back with captives of war set free.
He is detailing a completely new aesthetic for the church. He talks about masculine worship with psalms that sound like war cries and prayers that rattle gates of bronze.
Right.
And he is incredibly specific about who this aesthetic is built for. He is aiming squarely at young men.
Because he believes young men are starving for exactly this type of demanding, high-stakes environment.
He claims they are drowning in a modern culture that actively hates them. A culture that calls their natural strength toxic, labels their courage as bigotry, and treats their very maleness as a psychological problem that needs to be medicated away.
That's his core demographic argument.
Bae promises that if you offer these young men a tribe, a dangerous mission, and a king worth dying for, they will come alive. And his ultimate hook is that when the men come alive, the families will automatically follow.
It's a cascading demographic strategy. If you win the young men by validating their aggressive instincts, you secure the future households of the institution.
That makes sense from a growth perspective.
Let's unpack the sociological mechanics here. When a young man watches a video on a church screen of his peers confronting a hostile crowd, it triggers a profound neurological and psychological response.
Right.
It taps into a primal desire for brotherhood and honor that mainstream culture often fails to provide, which leaves them isolated.
It sounds like he's borrowing a page directly from epic fantasy or gaming culture building lore in a tribe.
Very much like that.
Like in an MMO, what keeps players hooked? It's the lore, the guild, the shared quests, the monuments to past victories. Bae is basically porting that exact psychological architecture into a real-world religious framework.
He really is. When the broader culture tells them your aggression is toxic and needs to be suppressed, Bae's movement counters with, no, your aggression is sacred, it just needs to be aimed at the right enemy.
It gives them permission to use their teeth.
It completely validates their core instincts instead of suppressing them. By creating this lore and putting the videos on the screens, Bae is telling these young men that their actions have epic, eternal significance.
They aren't just struggling through a mundane Tuesday at a desk job anymore.
Exactly. They are the modern equivalent of the legendary 30. He closes his text by quoting Psalm 144, "Blessed be the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle."
Wow.
He is offering an absolute, unyielding alternative to a world he views as deeply broken.
Which brings us back to you, listening to this deep dive right now. Whether you are exploring the theological implications of these biblical texts, fascinated by the sociology of how modern tribes are formed, or simply observing modern cultural shifts, Bae's text is a captivating look at how ancient warrior archetypes are being radically repurposed today.
It really is fascinating to watch unfold.
It highlights the immense tension between institutional niceness and the raw desire for unapologetic masculine purpose.
It forces us to examine the very foundations of how community identity is forged. And I would leave you with this final thought to mull over. Think about the communities or institutions you belong to. How much of their identity is built on lore, shared stories of overcoming adversity?
That's a great question.